Business School. Okay. Welcome to the Wits Business School webinar on employee ownership. The topic of this webinar is employee ownership, the journey to addressing wealth inequality in South Africa. With me, I have a panel of the following people. Professor Logan Rangasamy, an academic director from Wits Business School, Prof. Richard van Doel from Indiana University, and Dr. Shaun Smit from Transcend Capital, Dr. Jenica Gobind from Wits Business School, Ms. Lumka Kemele from the DTIC, and Mr. Tendani Nelwamondo from the Association of Employee Ownership in South Africa. And my name is Cindy Swatilane, also from the Association of Employee Ownership South Africa. Right, we are going to move along. The next person to talk on this webinar is Prof. Logan Rangasamy to give us the opening remarks. Over to you, Prof. Logan.
Yes, now thanks, Cindy. Good evening, everyone from South Africa. I was speaking to Richard earlier on. It's morning their time. It's really nice being part of this webinar. We look forward to some interesting discussions. So I've been asked to make some welcome introductory remarks. So let me do that very, very quickly so we can get to the much more substantive discussion. Wits University has just turned 100 years old this month. This is a great milestone and something that many Witsies are extremely proud of. The university is noted for its role as a force for positive change. Wits University is an iconic brand, having produced 4 Nobel laureates, approximately 30 Rhodes Scholars, and is home to 20% of all A-rated researchers in South Africa. But ranking amongst our greatest achievements are our graduates, over 200,000 of them, many of whom have embraced the university's vision of being socially responsive and adapting to an ever-changing world. The role that Wits has played in South Africa's transition to democracy is without question. Apart from our graduates assuming key leadership roles in government and business, the university has been at the forefront of many of the social and economic debates over its existence. In fact, I remember attending a workshop at this university in the early 90s, I think it was 91 or 92, at which some ANC leaders and South African academics were discussing the priorities and associated policies and actions that a new democratic government had to embrace. Improving the welfare of the vast majority of the population underpinned many of these priorities. I remember there were robust conversations on some of the micro details, but there was consensus that a democratic government had to prioritize improved access to quality education, housing, health, and economic opportunities. South Africa's constitution envisages a political and economic order which ensures that South Africa belongs to all who live in it, and end quote. This is the preamble to our constitution, which was passed in 1996. So put simply, our development path should be characterized by inter alia inclusive growth and economic equality. And this is what is envisaged in our constitution. So 28 years into democracy, our shortfalls and failures are conspicuous. Being the country with the worst income distribution in the world probably best sums up our dismal track record. Further evidence indicates that wealth inequality has not decreased since the end of apartheid in South Africa. Of greater concern, and something that we must not lose sight of, is the racial and gender dimensions of the inequality in South Africa. Concerns around compensation and employee benefits are raised annually during what has become known as the strike season in South Africa. Employee ownership has received increasing attention for its potential to secure improved economic outcomes for companies, workers, and the economy in general. Evidence indicates that employee ownership can help reduce inequality. I was somewhat intrigued by the research findings published by the Harvard Business School in a research paper that was published last year. The authors, Dudley and Rowan, find that if all private firms in the US became 30% employee-owned, this would, one, have a profound effect on the wealth distribution in the US, and two, the redistribution costs would be absorbed by the top 1% of wealth holders in the US. This is precisely the challenge that many countries face and need to tackle. Employee ownership does seem to offer some promise that we need to explore. This is certainly the case for South Africa. As you know, every cloud has a silver lining, which implies that every silver lining also has a cloud. So free rider problems, employee exposure to financial risk, lack of the required skill set by employees to fully understand the overall business operations that need to be tackled. This is where educational institutions like the Wits Business School can play a part. Our mission is to graduate agile and ethical leaders who are a force for positive change locally and globally. We believe we can achieve this through empowering education, relevant research, and impactful discourse. We hope to contribute to the issue of employee ownership through our course offerings, be they formalized program offerings or other short course offerings that we could offer through education, through the research that we will engage in, through collaborations with partners, some of which are part of the panel here today, and also through participation in discourses like the one we are having today. We have a great lineup of speakers who will talk on a number of interesting issues on how employee ownership can address the problem of racial wealth inequality in South Africa. A hearty welcome to all our speakers and our distinguished guests. We look forward to the presentations and the deliberations that are to follow. Over to you, Cindy.
Thank you, Prof. Rangasamy. And indeed, we are actually happy to have partnered with Wits Business School in this regard. Few things that have a takeoff for me as you are doing the welcome. Firstly, that Wits Business School is actually putting itself forward to be a research leader in this space, engage in executive education courses, and also collaborative arrangements with international partners. We are definitely happy with that arrangement, Prof, and I think it will be a good thing for South Africa for us to move forward as we influence this discussion around employee ownership. Next on our topic on the agenda is Tendani Nelwamondo, who will tell us about the Association of Employee Ownership in South Africa. Over to you, Tendani.
Thank you, Cindy, and thank you, Cindy, and thank you all the program, the panelists who are part of this panel of discussion today. And then I think my role is very straightforward, but I prepared a presentation that I will share, which I'm not going to present the entire or all slides that I've prepared. Let me just share the presentation with you. Then I don't know whether you can see it. Yeah, my presentation will only cover about 6 or 7 items, which will be the vision of the association, mission, and the focus area, objectives, as well as plans. I will also try to share one example on how we can use employee ownership to break wealth inequality barriers or income inequality in the country, and conclusion. Then, as Southern Africa Employee Ownership Association, it has been created to be a leading association in driving and promoting and guiding sustainable implementation of employee ownership enterprises in the Republic of South Africa and beyond. That's the vision that we've set for ourselves, and the mission is to provide a provision of employee ownership advisory, policy perspective, models for both local and international best practices, lesson learned and benchmarks, because there is a lot of literature that is available out there in the market that which we can learn a lot from it to craft our own employee ownership policy in South Africa. Then with regard to the focus of the association will want to be the voice of employee ownership issues in South Africa, investing in employee ownership models to break income inequality and build generational wealth. EO advisory to companies willing to venture or transit to employee ownership, advisory services to members and non-members on employee ownership aspects, employee ownership advisory and guidance to government on policy choices or selection or formulation of policies, facilitate distribution of wealth to broad-based beneficiaries. Example, it will be employees because our target clients is employees. Set up research hubs through collaboration with both local and international universities or colleges and research institutions. Conduct employee ownership benchmarks, best practices, lesson learned on employee ownership in partnership with local and international associations, and then give access to employee ownership information through seminars, workshops, meetings, conferences, webinars, or policy dialogues, etc. Then with regard to direct objectives of the association, we want to advocate for employee ownership solutions so that they can be adopted in public and private sector policies. Furthermore, involving trade unions and civil society organization in crafting part of these models or policy issues. Create a central reservoir of resources dealing with best practices in relation to the financial, corporate structuring, governance, and worker participation on the aspects of employee ownership. Develop a panel of experts to assist in the creation of employee-owned enterprises in the transition from conventional owned to employee-owned companies. Create training programs for companies, financial institutions, trade unions, and government officials to facilitate the establishment and successful functioning of employee-owned enterprises or businesses. Catalyze the creation of investment funds to purchase shares for employees through employee ownership or benefit trusts or other financing mechanism. I think this is very, very crucial, because why employee ownership is not really growing, one of the reasons is that we don't have a dedicated funding. Funding that is available currently, it's highly expensive for employees to can tap into. You can check like IDC or Industrial Development Corporation has funded most of employee-owned entities in South Africa, but employees will have to start for almost maybe 10 years before they can see real tangible benefits. I think maybe when the DTIC engage on their topic, maybe they will touch based on that, because one of the issues that we're trying to debate as the association is to say how employees can tap into the existing incentives. And if there is none, we are thinking that maybe we need to have a specific fund that need to be established so that it can finance employee ownership transactions in the country. And then the last objective is to ensure that we have documented, we document all the necessary research, sharing of information or stories of successful employee ownership enterprises through like the books or journals, and also make sure that we maintain the database of employee-owned enterprises in the country, because currently we don't have a public database that one can access very easily. Then when I come to the plans, I think I'll have to jump because part of it repeats some of the things that we just engage on the objectives, but you can read some of the plans that we have. Then when we come to the issue of example, here I will want to use example of Eskom. Eskom presents huge economic opportunity to can contribute significantly to the growth of employee ownership and reduce income inequality gap due to Eskom energy deficit, which is plus minus 5,000 megawatts, and everyday load shedding, which start from stage 2 up to stage 6 caused by system breakages of Eskom. Eskom has an economic opportunity to can deliberately give power purchase agreement to Eskom employee legal entity. It can be Eskom employee trust to generate and sell energy back to Eskom. This will be empowering to Eskom employees accordingly across the country. Then because Eskom has about almost 30,000 employees. Then I think if Eskom can do that, they will even reduce the rate of strikes that normally happens. You remember when the current load shedding started, it started during the strike of Eskom employees. And since then, we have been recovered from and then the strike was due to the wage negotiations. Furthermore, Eskom may lease the land to employee-owned companies to generate energy. You might be aware that Eskom last week has signed a leasing of land for 30 years to private companies for the land that is owned by Eskom so that they can generate electricity to mitigate the load shedding. Then from the association point of view, our argument was saying, why don't you lease that land to employee-owned entities so that they can generate electricity and sell that electricity back to Eskom as part of growing the uptake of employee ownership in the country. All profit to be realized from the sale of energy to Eskom shall be distributable to benefit broad-based employees and shall significantly contribute in shrinking wealth inequalities amongst employees and its dependents. The model can be replicated to other companies or state-owned entities across the country. Then in conclusion, employee ownership helps to narrow the wealth inequality gap for broad-based employees and their dependents. There is full papers as Prof. Logan indicated. You get most of this research not locally based, they are mostly internationally based. You get a lot of them from Rutgers University, and I think one of our guest speakers will touch on that because it's a fellow of Rutgers University Fellowship. Then he will share more about that. If more economic opportunities arises and are made available to employee ownership, the wealth gap might shrink quicker and benefit majority than individual companies. Those currently in the bottom of the wealth distribution will see substantial gains, with many of these gains going to traditional marginalized broad-based employees. Employee ownership is a natural remedy to keep wealth in the community and generate individual wealth to employees. Then I thank you, Cindy. Back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Tendani. And I believe that you shared a very interesting and a powerful perspective on employee ownership in South Africa. What I will ask now is for us to, for Tendani to introduce Prof. Van Doel from Rutgers University. Just a brief intro, and we give Prof. Van Doel an opportunity to tell us his international experience. Over to you, Tendani.
Thank you, Cindy, again. I think with regard to the introduction of Professor Richard Van Doel, I started knowing Professor Richard Van Doel, I think 2020, if I'm not mistaken, when he invited me to speak in their conference called Kelso conference that they normally held in January. He has a lot of experience on employee ownership. He has written journals and books around employee ownership. He represents the organization called Indianapolis National Center for Employee Ownership in United States of America. I don't want to spoil most of the experience and the knowledge that is going to share. I think I'll give the opportunity for Prof. Richard Van Doel to take us through his presentation based on the topic that we allocated to him, which he has a lot of experience on it, because what we have tried to do when we're designing the topics, we made sure that the topic that will be presented, it's in line with the papers or the books or chapters of the books that the speakers have written previously. Over to you, Prof. Van Doel.
Thank you very much, Tendani. And I'll share my presentation and we'll see if we can make this work. Okay, let's put this over here. So you guys can see my screen. Can you see the screen okay?
Yes, Richard, we can.
Okay, great. So technology works. That's awesome. So first off, I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today on the topic of governance and culture within employee-owned companies. Please note that my reference point will be primarily U.S. employee-owned companies, primarily through employee stock ownership plans, and my research recently published in the Journal for Participation in Employee Ownership. However, this information should be generalizable to the greater sphere of employee ownership, and I'm really looking forward to being able to share. As Tendani talked about, one of the key elements is understanding the benchmarks. What are other companies doing? How can I assess my company? How can I identify opportunities for improvement? And hopefully by the end of this presentation, you'll be able to have an idea on how to do that. Oops. So a little bit about me. In 2018, I led the conversion of my company, Performance Validation, to 100% S Corp ESOP. And after 28 years of service, I retired as the president, but I continued to serve as the board chairperson. I founded the Indiana Center for Employee Ownership in 2017. I obtained my PhD from Indiana Wesleyan University in the discipline of organizational leadership. And my dissertation topic was exploring stewardship characteristics in the professional, scientific, and technical services employee-owned companies, examining the influence of stewardship on employee-owned governance and firm productivity. As Tendani said, I was awarded a Louis O. Kelso Fellowship from the School of Management and Labor Relations at Rutgers University in 2015. And I served my country in the U.S. Navy, having retired as a Chief Warrant Officer in 1993. So I have about 40 years of experience between military, for-profit, not-for-profit leadership. And I'm very pleased to be able to share some of this information with you today.
Excuse me, Prof. Prof, we do not see your screen. We only see your notes.
Oh, okay. Hold on.
Let's just do something about it.
All right, well, hold on. Let me see if I can fix this. Share screen. Sure. Okay, do you see the slide?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Good. Okay. So first off, let's talk, what is governance? And corporate governance is a system of rules, practices, and processes by which a firm is directed and controlled. And governance can be described as either agency or stewardship. And under agency theory, it's based on McGregor's theory X, nature of humanity. And theory X is based on three constructs, where management is responsible for the organization and the use of organizational resources to achieve organization's goals. In doing so, management is responsible to provide direction and motivation and implement controls, because without management intervention, the worker would be resistant to achieve the organization's goals. Agency theory really builds upon McGregor's theory by using transactional controls such as employee contracts, management by objectives to align the interest of the agent to the owner. So really, it's a question of, tit for tat, or what will I do for you and what will you give me for it? Whereas stewardship is based on McGregor's theory Y organizational behavior of management theory. And this is a little bit different, although there are some similarities with agency theory. So management is still responsible for the organization and use of organizational resources. However, organizational experience has conditioned the worker to resist the needs of the organization. And this is where the big differences happen. Under theory Y, each person is believed to have the potential to develop, assume responsibility, and lead. And management really has the responsibility, rather than directing it, to free the binds that prevent the organizational members from achieving their true potential. What can I do to allow you to be successful, as opposed to telling you what to do? Stewardship theory is based on the supposition that the interests of the agent to the principal are aligned such that pro-organizational collectivist behaviors have higher utility than individual self-serving behaviors. So they're more concerned with the organization and the group goals as opposed to individual goals. And even though these two theories focus on corporate governance and business growth, there's a significant difference between agency theory and stewardship theory. Agency theory refers to relationship between the owner and the agent, while stewardship theory refers to the relationship between the owner and the steward. Moreover, agency theory is really based on management and economic principles. Again, what will you do for me and what will I pay you to do? Where stewardship theory is really based on psychology and sociology. Under agency theory, the claims are that improved performance is due to the implemented governance structures by the principal to limit the opportunistic behavior of the agent. So there's going to be controls in place to prevent that agent from going off and looking after his own interest as opposed to the organization's interest. However, stewardship theory claims that improved performance is due to the principal encouraging governance structure that motivates pro-organizational behavior of the steward. Another difference is that agency theory is really driven by extrinsic motivation, whereas the stewardship theory is driven by intrinsic motivation. This doesn't mean that we need to be able to provide our employees with a living wage to be able to satisfy those basic needs of food, shelter, safety, because simply providing intrinsic things, thank you, appreciation, when they can't afford to eat or sleep or have a place to stay, isn't going to be of value. But that's one of the significant differences between agency theory and stewardship theory. According to agency theory, managers have a low level of identification with the organization, and this really allows the self-serving interest to be chosen over the owner's interest. In contrast, according to stewardship theory, managers have a high level of identification with the organization. Therefore, high level identification empowers executives or stewards to work hard, sorting out problems, and finally gaining intrinsic rewards by the principal. Just imagine if you had 100 people helping you solve a problem as opposed to 1 or 2, the value that that could bring to the organization. In summary, both agency and stewardship theory are corporate governance principles in the modern business world. However, key differences between agency and stewardship theory is that agency theory is an economic model, where the stewardship theory is a psychological and sociological model, and we'll learn more about that as we look at the individual constructs. One of the differences in employee-owned companies in the US is that the trustee may require 1 or more external board members. And this is part of, I think, growing up of a company to move from an internal board or maybe the management team, which is also the board of directors, and having an outside member participate in the board to give you fresh ideas, to maybe challenge some of the things that the board's done, and to make sure that the company is doing the things that it needs to be done. In a traditional company, right, you have shareholders that elect the board elects the CEO and president, the president hires the managers, and the managers hires the employees. Well, in an employee-owned company, it's very similar, with the addition of, depending upon the percentage of ownership by the ESOP, you could have 100% ownership where you have 1 shareholder, which is the ESOP trustee, or you might have a minority shareholder where perhaps it's a 30% ESOP and 70% of the company is still owned by other shareholders. But the shareholders still elect the board selects the trustee, and the board still appoints and oversees the CEO president, who oversees the managers and oversees the employees. Another difference is that typically we have an employee ownership communications committee which provides some of that education and information between the company and the employees that Tendani was talking about. And the employees are represented by the ESOP participants, or they're represented by the fiduciary committee to the ESOP trustee. So it's a little different, but in general, it follows this traditional company board of governance. So we've talked a little about governance. Now we want to talk a little about culture. And culture is a pattern of shared basic assumptions that the group learned as it solved its problems of external adaptation and internal integration that has worked well enough to be considered valid and therefore to be taught to new members as the correct way to perceive, think, and feel in relation to those problems. And this is a quote from Edgar Schein, who is a well-known cultural researcher. And really, it's less of what you say and more of what you do. A lot of companies will have very flowery words, or they'll have posters up, but how they actually act and react doesn't really reflect back to what they say. So it really gets back to how do you react, what do you reward, and are those things consistent in their approach? Culture really lies at the heart of governance. They're really intertwined. It informs the group's rules and values, what's the right way of exercising power and governing, and what's the wrong way. And of course, as Peter Drucker said, culture eats strategy for breakfast. So why is this important? Well, simply changing the organizational structure from private to broad-based ownership typically doesn't change the organizational culture or behavior. This really has to be intentional. And as Tendani said, part of this is educational. Employees need to understand, how does the firm make money? How do their efforts impact the organization? Can they really connect the dots between what I do and the value that it brings to the company? And another aspect of this that's really, really important is that even if the firm shares financial information with the employees, if the employees don't have the financial literacy and business acumen, how can they make sense of that information and how can they use it to help them grow the company? And part of this is based on what the organization and its leaders pay attention to and how they reward their employees and what those rewards are based upon. Do the actions match what the organization is saying? So prior research has identified that stewardship characteristics are commonly observed in companies with an employee ownership culture, and these types of companies, typically see improved performance. 73% of ESOP companies reported that the ESOP improved company performance by motivating employees to work with an ownership attitude. Part of that is peer pressure to try to reduce that free rider problem. And 64% reported that ESOP improved organization competitiveness. They grow 6 to 11% faster than expected. They experience growth at a higher rate post-ESOP when compared to growth levels pre-ESOP. And I really feel that this gets back to the fact that you have more people involved in a participative involvement-oriented management philosophy to be able to help drive solutions and drive the growth of the company. And my own research identified higher levels of productivity as defined by revenue per employee as the level of stewardship increased within the company. And this really drove my research question. The transition of employees to employee owners presents a unique governance situation where the employee owners may simultaneously be an owner, a principal, and an agent. So when employees are faced with this trinity, to what extent do employee owners demonstrate agency or stewardship characteristics? In other words, do employee owners demonstrate McGregor's theory X or theory Y? Excuse me. So part of the research that I did, I used the Stewardship Climate Scale, which was developed by Craig, DeBrill, Newbrom, and Thomas. And this is a valid and reliable instrument to measure governance. It uses 18 survey questions, 3 questions per construct. It's really simple, it's really easy, and it took less than 5 minutes typically for the participants to complete. And it's a quantitative instrument measuring the 6 constructs of stewardship in the psychological and situational mechanism domains. So under psychological, excuse me, and it measured those constructs on a 7-point Likert scale, with 1 to 3 being agency, 4 being neutral, and then 5 to 7 being stewardship. Under the psychological mechanism, we have organizational identification, And this is defined as the psychological bond linking the individual and the organization. The organizational identification is a combination of acceptance of the organization's mission, vision, and purpose as their own, and continuance commitment, the desire of the individual to remain with the organization, and the decision of the individual's effort to produce for the organization. We look at use of personal power, and power is really one of the 5 types of social influence that's used to affect change within the organization. There are 5 power types organized into 2 dimensions. A lot of times, institutional power, which is power given to a person based on their position, includes coercive, legitimate, and reward power, and this type of power represents agency governance. Whereas personal power, which includes expert and reverent power, and represents stewardship governance. And organizations that rely on institutional power demonstrate agency governance, while organizations that rely on personal power demonstrate stewardship governance. And then the last element of the psychological element is motivation. And intrinsic motivation, or motivation, could be internal, external, or some combination of the 2 factors that really inspire an individual to take an action. Extrinsic is an agency approach and uses pay, perks, and rewards to gain alignment of the individual to the organizational objectives. A lot of times for extrinsic motivation, people will only stay as long as those needs are still met. And when they're not, they leave and cause gap issues for the company. Intrinsic is a stewardship approach and uses self-determination, job enrichment, participative involvement in management, and employee empowerment to gain alignment of the individual to the organization. And organizations that rely on extrinsic motivation typically exhibit agency governance, whereas organizations that rely on intrinsic motivation demonstrate stewardship governance. And then under the situational mechanisms, we have involvement orientation, collectivist orientation, and power distance. And for involvement orientation, it may be broadly generalized as either a control or an involvement management philosophy. A control-oriented philosophy employs a hierarchical top-down management approach where there's little to no discretion is allowed or encouraged. So basically, it's a top-down management structure. A control-oriented management philosophy is consistent with agency governance, whereas an involvement-oriented philosophy is characterized by job enrichment, participative decision-making, or problem-solving, where employee rewards are based on both profit or gain sharing or employee ownership. And the work climate in involvement-oriented strategy is one of self-control, self-management, where employees are challenged to take responsibility to develop new ideas and new approaches to solve organizational problems. Oftentimes, the workers are the closest ones to the work in the field. They're the ones that are seeing what's going on, and they have a lot of good ideas on how things could be improved. But is the organization willing to listen to them and take their ideas? An involvement-oriented management philosophy is really consistent with stewardship governance. Next is a collectivist orientation. And within an organization, individuals demonstrating collectivism behavior define themselves as part of the organization, where group identity and a sense of belonging reigns supreme. The culture of the organization can have an individualistic or collectivist orientation, or sometimes a mix of both. Organizations with an individualistic culture have a focus on task accomplishment over relationships, a right of privacy, and often an IU mentality. Organizations with a collectivist culture have a focus on taking care of the well-being of other members of the organization and places organization or group goals ahead of individual goals. Key characteristics that describe a collectivist-based culture include a focus on relationships over task accomplishment, a strong desire to belong to and integrate with the group, a we-they mentality, conformance to group opinion, and sometimes an unwillingness to introduce conflict. Davis described collectivist behavior similar to Hofstede, a willing to sacrifice individual goals for the achievement of group goals, strong identification of the individual to the organization, and aversion of conflict, and business being conducted based on relationships and trust. Thus, organizations that have a collectivist focus have a disposition towards a stewardship theory of governance. And then the last construct is power distance. And power distance really describes the relationship between those in power and those and their subordinates. The power distance that's accepted within the organization will determine to what degree the employee owners are allowed to participate in decision-making within the organization. In high power distance organizations, power is centralized within a very narrow group, and this group is typically responsible for all decisions with little to no input from group members, and a directive or telling management style, and is really reflective of an autocratic or control style leadership or agency governance. However, in low power distance organizations, power is decentralized, decision-making is participatory, and a transformational or involvement-oriented leadership style is utilized with the expectation of employee input to help solve problems. And that's really a key difference. As you'll see the results, there is variation in the aggregate and individual constructs. Not all employee companies have only stewardship governance, and there are instances where there are employee owners that have, an agency governance. But if we take a look at the governance and culture comparison between agency, stewardship, and then US ESOPs, we can see that really ESOPs are more aligned towards a stewardship governance than an agency governance. Under organizational identification, agency is low, whereas stewardship and ESOP it's high. On use of power, typically in an agency governance, it's institutional, it's legitimate power based on that person's position and authority, whereas in stewardship and ESOPs, it's personal or group. Under motivation, under agency, it's extrinsic. There's a lot of controls and there's perks associated with those controls. And in stewardship and an ESOP, it's intrinsic. And then management philosophy, control under agency, and involvement philosophy under stewardship and ESOP. Culture, similar, individualistic under agency and collectivist under stewardship and ESOP. And then power distance, again, high in agency and low in stewardships. And ESOPs with an employee ownership culture are aligned more towards the characteristics of stewardship than agency governance. And this hypothesis was confirmed during research. So when we look at the individual results, the overall climate of the organization, approximately 96% of the companies participating in the study self-identified with governance, with stewardship governance. Only 6 of the 154 companies self-identified with agency governance. And again, as we discuss the results from the stewardship climate scale and the individual constructs, think about your organization and how you might use these benchmarks to evaluate your organization and identify the opportunities for change. As we look at the individual constructs, I'll share with you the questions that we included in the quantitative survey, as well as some qualitative results, and think about how these questions might inform your company. So the psychological mechanisms, about 95% of the companies participating in the study self-identified with stewardship governance for the aggregate of the psychological mechanisms. And again, this included organizational identification, power type, and motivation. Only 7 of the 154 companies self-identified with agency governance. And when we look at organizational identification, this is the first construct under the psychological mechanisms. 99% of the companies participating in the study self-identified as having a strong level of organizational identification. Only 2 of the 154 companies self-identified as having a low level of organizational identification. And the questions that we asked to determine this were, to what extent do the following statements reflect the beliefs of the employees of your company? The company's successes are the employee's successes. When someone praises the company, it feels like a personal compliment. Employees feel a sense of ownership for this organization rather than just being an employee. 2 of the interviewed CEOs each shared an example of employees going above and beyond the requirements of their jobs. In other words, these employees demonstrated a strong organizational identification. The first example is about an employee self-directed team having to repackage a customer's order due to a change in the customer's end customer requirements and needs. All this repacking was done without hesitation, with some employees actually staying late. The second example involved an employee helping a customer use a piece of rented equipment supplied by the ESOP. For about 45 minutes after delivery, the team member stayed with the renter, showed them how to set up the equipment, showed them how to use the equipment. The employee's responsibility was only to deliver the rented equipment. And both of these examples display a strong psychological bond between the individual, employee, and success of the organization. When we look at use of personal power, approximately 95% of the companies participating in the study self-identified as using personal power predominantly within the organization. Only 8 of the 154 companies self-identified as having a preference for institutional power. And the personal power questions were, to what extent do the following statements reflect the supervisors in your company? Supervisors are individuals that employees can identify with. Supervisors give good reasons for changing how employees do their jobs. And supervisors have more technical knowledge. One senior leader shared an example about how a recently hired safety professional who was considered junior staff. This safety professional used her research, keen observation of safety issues, and discussion with vendors and employees to develop her ability to influence others simply based on her positional expertise, based on her personal knowledge and power. The next construct is motivation, and approximately 93% of companies participating in the study self-identified as using intrinsic motivation within the organization. Only 11 of the 154 companies self-identified as having a preference for external motivation. And our motivational questions were, to what extent are employees in your organization satisfied with the various facets of their job? The extent that supervisors express appreciation to subordinates, the extent that supervisors give credit to the subordinates for their work, the extent that supervisors give praise to employees for good job performance. In the interview, a CEO shared that on a particular weekend, they had 2 no-shows at work, and due to the manufacturing processes which needed to be run, they couldn't bring in temporary workers to cover the no-shows. The end result was that an employee who ran the product by himself, moving from station to station to keep the process going for about 6 hours until other employees were able to get there to help. In the second example, an employee who was working another weekend and a semi-trailer showed up to be unloaded. The company doesn't receive shipments on weekends because the warehouse staff doesn't work weekends. However, the shipment arrived and the employee unloaded the truck himself because he thought it was an important shipment since a customer had sent it. As it turned out, the shipment was critical ingredient to the company that needed to process on the following Monday morning. So had he not done that, the material would have stayed in the truck and it would have delayed processing the material. When we look at the situational mechanisms, approximately 94% of the companies participating in the study self-identified with stewardship governance for the aggregate of situational mechanisms, which includes, in management philosophy, social orientation, and power distance. Only 9 of the 154 companies self-identified with agency governance. And the involvement orientation questions were, to what extent do the following statements reflect the beliefs of employees in your company's managers? Managers' decisions are influenced by employees' input. Managers try to reach consensus among employees on important decisions, and managers make employees feel like they work with them, not for them. And it's really important to make sure that our employees understand that we're not going to vote on every decision that the company does, but that doesn't mean that the employees don't have a voice in how we do things. And 2 examples from the interviews were, one CEO mentioned that his goal is to push decision-making down to the level that affects the customer. The CEO shared an example of a cashier working with a customer on a return. The CEO indicated that he would like the cashier to feel empowered to make the decision to accept the return rather than asking the customer to stand there while other customers are waiting in line to check with the manager for approval. So they really want to push that decision-making down to the lowest level. Another CEO mentioned that he called a meeting because there was an issue with how the ESOP was tracking inventory for a customer. He started the meeting off, shared his observations, and why there appeared to be an issue to him. The CEO indicated to the meeting attendees that he was not an expert in the problem area and really wanted their input on the situation. His objective was to get the group talking, and then he left the meeting and allowed the team to resolve the issue. And the last, for collectivist orientation, approximately 99% of the companies participating in the study self-identified as having a collectivism orientation. Only 2 of the 154 companies self-identified as having a preference for an individualistic culture. And for collectivist orientation, our questions were, to what extent do the following statements reflect the beliefs of employees in your company? Cooperation among team members usually helps to solve problems. Teamwork Team-based work provides the best work performance, and teamwork is central to an effective organization. 3 ESOP leaders shared examples of how their organization supports the collectivist culture. One leader noted they shared financials monthly, they share revenue for the whole company throughout the week so employees and teams know how they're doing and where they are by department. Another leader shared the organization's management philosophy that people are people. In other words, they're not tools, they are people. We need to respect that, and we need to make sure that they don't micromanage their teams. Finally, a third leader shared how every employee's bonus program, from the CEO to the management team to all employees, has exactly the same metric. And then based on this bonus program, all the employees win or lose together. And then the final attribute is power distance. Approximately 84% of the companies participating in the study self-identified as having a preference for a low power distance culture. 25 of 154 companies, and this is the lowest scoring construct, self-identified as having a preference for a high power distance culture. And the power distance questions were, to what extent do you agree with the following statements about managerial decision-making behaviors in your company? Managers make decisions without consulting subordinates. Managers frequently use authority and power when dealing with subordinates. And managers do not delegate important tasks to employees. 3 CEOs shared examples of how low power distance, which is characterized by approachability, decentralization of authority and decision-making, and expectation of employee input to help solve problems. The first CEO mentioned that he tells his management team all the time, if a decision is made and an employee challenges that decision or asks why it was done, and you can't provide an answer, it was probably a bad decision. The second CEO shared that employees are absolutely empowered. There are no questions off limits and no bad questions. There may be a question the leadership teams decide it's not going to answer, although that's really rare. And the leadership team consistently encourages people to speak up. And then lastly, the third CEO indicated they have an open door policy, which they actually follow. Anyone can walk in the CEO's office and talk to him. The company also has quarterly meetings where employees can always ask questions. So one of the questions obviously is, well, is this just a US phenomena and basically every other country is different? And while I don't have a great deal of information, we did do recent research with Scottish Employee Ownership Trust, and we had 14 respondents, which at the time was about 10% of the EOTs in Scotland. We used the same instrumentation, the Stewardship Climate Scale, and we identified a very similar results. So one of the interesting elements is that if you look at the results, the psychological mechanisms here scored higher than the situational mechanisms in both cases. So that's kind of interesting. And secondly, collectivism was the highest scoring construct in both US and Scottish ESOPs, and power distance scored the lowest construct of both. So I think that's kind of interesting in terms of similarities between 2 different nations and employee ownership. And I think that does tend to believe that employee ownership culture is really unique to the genre of employee ownership as opposed to national culture. The last thing I'll speak to this is that all of the data was evaluated using a single t-test to evaluate the observed mean versus a hypothetical mean of 4, which was the midpoint of the Stewardship Climate Scale. All of the observed results were statistically significant with a p-level of less than 0.05. So the results are correct, and again, it did support the hypothesis that employee ownership is prevalent within employee-owned companies. So in summary, based on the research, a majority of employee-owned companies have a stewardship governance perspective, which relates to an employee ownership culture. And this appears to be common to employee-owned companies, both ESOPs and EOTs, although the data is very narrow. And US leaders' opinion were that the level of stewardship increased over time. Many companies transitioning to employee ownership already have a stewardship type culture or governance, but even those that had a control-oriented philosophy or an agency governance identified that over time they transitioned to more stewardship, and those that were stewardship increased over time. So what's some future research that we can take a look at to help evolve or help inform this information? So the first one obviously would be to examine governance or culture in other countries with employee ownership, and just to kind of defend, is this really consistent with other countries? Examine the governance and culture within all employees rather than a single senior leader. Again, because of the nature of the research, we used one senior leader from an ESOP, and there is a potential for some self-reporting bias, although some of the information that I have would say that that's not the case. But again, the data is really limited. And then benchmark employee-owned and non-employee-owned similar companies to see if there really is a difference between employee ownership or not employee ownership. And that's the end of my presentation. I thank you very much for your time. Are there any questions? If not, I'll turn it back to Cindy.
Thank you, Prof. Cindy has handed over to me now to facilitate. Thank you so much for the in-depth presentation about the research that you did about employee ownership. I think we'll give the opportunity for people to ask questions after all presenters. Then we will want to move to the other presenter, which is Dr. Shaun Smit. Then in brief, maybe if I can just introduce Dr. Smith. I knew him when I was still working for Industrial Development Corporation. And then when I was still running the program called Workers' Trust within IDC. Shaun is a director at Transcend Capital. It's a leading ESOP and BE transaction advisors for multinational and South African corporate companies for over 15 years. You can see the experience that he has. I know they've done a lot of transaction. If you go to their website, you'll be able to pull out a lot of information. And I think the topic that Shaun is going to talk about, it will be ESOPs achieving BE ownership through employee ownership. They've written a very nice, interesting paper, and I think Shaun was leading in writing that paper. Then he's going to share with us around how employee ownership works within the BE space. Thank you. Over to you, Shaun.
Thanks, Tendani. And good afternoon, everyone. And thank you, the Southern African Employee Ownership Association and Wits Business School, for inviting me to participate today. As Tendani said, my name is Shaun Smit, and I'm a director at Transcend Capital. Transcend Capital is a boutique corporate finance advisory firm that specializes in ESOP and BE transaction advisory. And I've spent the last 15 years or so supporting multinationals and South African corporates on their BE ownership journeys, in many cases involving ESOPs. And Prof. Rangasamy, I'm a proud Wits graduate. Transcend Capital is part of the Transcend Group, which overall provides BE advisory services across the BE scorecard. And since 2005, we've assisted hundreds of companies build and implement BE strategy that is beyond compliance, drives real transformation, and makes business sense. In the context of the general topic of today's webinar, I think ESOPs can definitely address wealth inequality. Today's business world is characterized by technological advancement and concentrated ownership of productive assets. And this results in income being concentrated with the owners of the capital and related economic insecurity for the majority of the population. Although it's fairly old now, when last measured in, I think, around 2016, South Africa's Gini coefficient was the highest in the world, and this expresses high income inequality across the population. I'm doubtful, though, that post-COVID, we have moved far or at all from that shameful top spot. High income inequality has several undesirable economic and political impacts, and these include political polarization, slower economic growth, greater household debt, reduced income mobility, and higher poverty rates. Employee ownership offers a more balanced economy with more distributed capital ownership, and this is particularly relevant in our country. with the numerous socioeconomic challenges that it faces. So employee ownership offers benefits at societal level, organizational level, and individual level. Now, the South African government has specifically identified employee ownership as a means to facilitate broad-based Black economic empowerment, otherwise known as BBBEE, otherwise known as BEE, which is less of a mouthful and is the acronym that I'm going to be using today. I've been asked to talk about achieving BEE ownership through employee ownership. So I'm going to be talking about where we are now in terms of BEE and employee ownership, and also looking at possibly where to from here. I think I'd like to start off by reviewing BEE. In 1994, South Africa's first democratic government was elected, and it had a clear mandate to redress the inequalities of the apartheid past. And it embarked on a comprehensive program to provide a legislative framework for the transformation of South Africa's economy. And this was the start of BEE.
Excuse me, Shaun.
In 2003.
Hi, Shaun.
Yeah?
We can't see your presentation. I'm not sure if you're sharing.
No, I'm not sharing any presentation.
Cool. Oh, great. Thank you.
Yeah. In 2003, the BEE strategy was published, and this was essentially the precursor to the BEE Act, which provides the legislative framework for the promotion of BEE. And this had a fundamental objective to enhance the economic participation of Black people in the South African economy. Leading on from this, in 2007, the BEE Codes of Good Practice were gazetted, and these provided an implementation framework for BEE policy and legislation. There was a major overhaul of the codes in 2013 and some further updates in 2019. So how do employees and ESOPs potentially fit into the BEE framework? Now, without diving deeply into how BEE achievement is measured, in the current form, the BEE Codes of Good Practice set out a balanced scorecard of 5 pillars across which BEE is measured. And these include ownership, management control, skills development, enterprise and supply development, and socioeconomic development. Now, employees are obviously explicitly covered under management control and skills development, but from an ownership perspective, they can benefit through employee ownership. And if we unpack the ownership pillar of the generic BEE scorecard, it's not just a single measure of ownership in a measured enterprise. Rather, the ownership scoring is broken up into 3 main categories, being economic interest, voting rights, and net value. Now, economic interest essentially addresses the rights to share in the financial fruits of ownership, and that's dividends, that's typically dividends and capital gains. When we look at voting rights, that's looking at the right to participate in shareholder decision-making. And the last main category under the ownership pillar is net value, which talks about wealth creation in the hands of Black investors, which is essentially taking the value of the shares in the investor's hands, as well as assessing the outstanding acquisition debt. And this net value concept is a key focus under the ownership pillar. As for example, one might have a 25% shareholding in a business, but the investor may have negative equity in the transaction if the debt is essentially greater than the value of the investment. And the codes address this by setting out time-based value creation targets, which increase over a 9-year period. Now, employee ownership is actually specifically addressed within the economic interest category. Now, as I said, economic interest addresses the rights to share in the fruits of ownership, which is typically dividends and capital appreciation. And the economic interest category is broken up into subcategories within that. And one of them essentially enables an additional 3 points of the 25 points if the ownership is achieved through an ESOP. In addition to that, there's also new entrant points. And these are available where the BEE investors have not previously held investments worth more than 50 million rand. And if we think about an ESOP and the underlying employee beneficiaries, it's almost always the case that they would be seen as new entrants. So implementing an ESOP could possibly unlock additional BEE recognition and points in that regard. Now, it's worth noting that the BE Code sets out various structural and operational requirements that must be met in order for BE ownership to be recognized through an ESOP. And I'm not going to go into the details of those various requirements now, but fundamentally, these address ensuring transparent ESOP benefit structures, employee representation within the ESOP governance, and strong employee communication and scheme operationalization. So as you can see, ESOPs do fit into the BE framework, and if structured correctly, they can enable BE ownership recognition and healthy point scoring. BE, in fact, has been the main driver of ESOP implementation in South Africa over the last 15 years. So how are ESOPs structured then? Well, in South Africa, and again, in the context of BE, which has been the main driver of ESOP implementation, ESOPs typically hold a minority investment in companies, and this is usually between a 5% and 25% shareholding. While an ESOP may involve the employees holding actual shares in the business, most often the shareholding is held by a trust, with eligible employees benefiting as beneficiaries of the trust. Now, looking at the actual benefit structure within ESOPs, they can be structured in many different ways. And this can range from something fairly simple to quite complex ESOP structures. Some focus on dividend participation over time. Others focus on capital appreciation over a period. Some have fixed terms of life, and others are structured to be evergreen and effectively to go on indefinitely. Whenever you're structuring an ESOP, it is really important to be clear on the objectives and to ultimately identify what makes most sense for your business, given your specific circumstances and needs. And this requires careful consideration of what the available options are, as well as the related implications. And when I talk about implications, obviously, BE is a key aspect, again, in the South African context, but also legal, HR, financial, tax, and accounting. You really need to understand all the implications to ultimately identify the scheme that makes most sense for your business. And when you're looking at implementing an ESOP, what we found is that it's really important to also do in-depth analysis and modeling of the proposed ESOP. So as I've mentioned, BE has driven ESOP implementation in South Africa. But again, coming back to the main topic of today, has wealth inequality been addressed through ESOPs? And in short, I think the answer is yes. But if we unpack this a little bit, I think there are a number of ESOPs that have not delivered the intended benefits to employees. And then there have also been a number of ESOPs that have outright failed in terms of achieving those objectives. So besides for the lack of benefit to the ESOP participants themselves, this can be to the detriment of the employing company, with weakened employee morale, possible loss of talent, and a drop in business performance. Aside from some ESOPs which have not delivered meaningful financial outcomes, I don't believe that ESOPs have necessarily been a primary focus for BE transactions. And also, when implemented, as I mentioned, ESOPs are frequently at fairly low levels of shareholding in a business. So I believe that the total financial benefit from ESOPs and the related possible impact on inequality in South Africa has been less than it arguably could have been. So the question is then, how can we better address wealth inequality through ESOPs? And what role does BE play in this? Now, wealth inequality is reduced through ESOPs when meaningful financial benefit is delivered to a broader base of employees. And if we consider a single company implementing an ESOP, meaningful financial ESOP benefit happens when, firstly, the value of the ESOP's shareholding grows faster than the underlying acquisition debt. And secondly, the ESOP shareholding percentage is at a level at which the absolute value of that shareholding is meaningful, taking the ESOP benefit structure into account. As I mentioned, in-depth evaluation of structural options and related analysis is massively important and needs to consider the particular circumstances of the company implementing the ESOP. Growth projections have got to be realistic. I often find that there's rosy outlooks, and that can, I guess, provide misleading views of what potentially the outcomes could be. In addition, the funding terms really need to be fair, and the deal needs to be structured over a longer term and to ideally avoid single period value outcomes, as these can often lead to binary outcomes for employees. And that's often been the pitfall for many ESOPs. Now, Prof. Van Doel has spoken about the governance and culture within employee-owned companies. And this cultural aspect and alignment of purpose towards success and value creation can be a powerful benefit of ESOPs, and interlinks obviously with the financial benefit. I really like that discussion around the stewardship principle. Now, good scheme governance or good ESOP governance, as well as strong employee training and communication and management of employee expectations, is crucial, as well as leadership buy-in and strong top-down messaging from leadership. If we consider the broader positive societal impact of ESOPs, we need more ESOPs implemented that collectively deliver meaningful financial benefit. And I think, again, BEE has a key role in achieving this, as it's a key driver of employee ownership implementation in South Africa. If we look at the definition of BEE, it's defined as, it's defined in the BEE Act, at least, as viable economic empowerment of Black people. And specifically, it highlights workers and mentions employee ownership. So maybe there needs to be more of a focus on the broad-based aspect of broad-based Black economic empowerment. If more ESOPs are desired, with related impact on broadening ownership in the economy and reducing inequality, government should incentivize this through ESOP-related BEE policy. And this could, for example, mean increasing ESOP recognition, targets, or related points. So in closing, I'd like to again refer to the BEE Act, which in its preamble highlights that South Africa's economy, at least, still excludes the vast majority of its people from ownership of productive assets. And the economy performs below its potential because of the low level of income earned by the majority of its people. And unless further steps are taken to increase the effective participation of the majority of South Africans in the economy, the stability and prosperity of the economy in the future may be undermined to the detriment of all South Africans. BEE ownership can certainly be successfully addressed through employee ownership. More than this, though, I believe that BEE should be the catalyst for ESOP implementation, and that there is real opportunity to address the persistent high levels of economic inequality in South Africa and drive transformation and economic growth. Thank you. That's me. Back to you, Cindy.
Thank you, Dr. Smith. What an interesting presentation, and also analysis in terms of your conclusion remarks when you say indeed implementing ESOP can be used in South Africa to improve BEE ownership. However, there are certain steps that would need to be considered. And I believe if we have the DTIC, Ms. Lumka Kemele, who's going to take us through what is the role of the DTIC and how do they support BEE and employee ownership. She would then probably touch on exactly what is it that the DTIC is suggesting and what is it that the DTIC has promised to do, and how can we, as the association and the practitioners, tap into what the government is promising in terms of achieving ownership using employee ownership. Moving on, we are now going to call upon Ms. Lumka Kemele from the DTIC. Ms. Lumka Kemele, she is a BEE advisory within the Department of Trade and Industry. She has more than 10 years experience working in that professional and advisory space of BEE. And she is a skilled researcher and a practitioner in the BEE space. Lumka, please take us through what is the role and how do you support BEE and employee ownership in South Africa? Thank you.
Thank you, Cindy, and thank you to the panelists. What a great discussion from the panelists there. As introduced, my name is Lomka Kemele. I'm from the DTIC. I'm responsible for the BE drafting of the legislation. And I think Shaun has said it enough in terms of the broad-based BE and its creation and where it is coming from. And I think if you have been following in terms of the journey of the broad-based BE since its inception in the first Act gazetted in 2003, there has been a lot of changes along the way in terms of trying to sort of improve in the policy itself, and also try to see where it is fallen short. And with the amendments in 2013, where we had now to look at the 2007 vis-a-vis now the 2013, where now we have these 5 elements within the codes of good practice, where we also looked at the 3 priority elements, and those of which skills development, enterprise and supply development, and also ownership. Because if you have looked in terms of the 2007 codes of good practice, companies would choose any in terms of those 7 elements at the time, but they would not choose any ownership in terms of their implementation. So one of the key issues, if you look at now the practice note that the minister issued in 2021, talks about the issues of the discretionary collective enterprises, that was published in the Government Gazette on the 18th of May 2021. It is the result of extensive consultation with stakeholders in government and also the private sector. The drafting process commenced in 2020, the interpretational misalignment which necessitated the Gazette was identified as early as in 2019. And this practice note was well received by the market, because you'll remember that there was that sort of misalignment between the BE Commission and how these broad-based schemes are interpreted in the market. And that's how the practice note came about. And when you look into the strategy, we've got these 4 key principles, where we look at Black economic empowerment as broad-based, societies that are characterized by racial or ethnically defined wealth disparities are not likely to be socially and politically stable. The process of BE seeks to accelerate the de-racialization of the South African economy and fast-track the re-entry of historically marginalized communities into the mainstream of the economy. And then you look at now BE as an inclusive process. A more equitable economy will benefit all South Africans, individuals and enterprises. The process of BE is an inclusive one, and all enterprises operating within South Africa can and indeed should participate in this process. This strategy will be implemented throughout all sectors of the economy and is not limited only to those enterprises that derive income from government procurement, or those where the sectors in regulated by government. So now you'll notice that now we've got the BE Commission that came as a result of the amendments of the Act in 2013, where previously we didn't have a BE Commission, so that all companies in the economy, JSE companies, must be able to report in terms of their BE implementation, and that also look again in the private as well as in the public sector in terms of reporting on how do we implement the BE in the space. And then you also look at the issues of governance that were spoke about by the previous presenters. A fundamental part of our economic reform and transformation is improving the quality and transparency of all economic activities. Accordingly, BE must be associated with and ensure the highest standard of corporate governance. Concerted effort will be made to ensure that the quality of corporate boards and governance is improved. And also, when we talk about also the growth strategy, economic growth, development, and BE are complementary and related process. Government approaches is that BE must be an inclusive process and not an exclusive process. No economy can grow by excluding any part of its people, and an economy that is not growing cannot integrate all its citizens in a meaningful way. As such, this strategy stresses a BE process that is associated with growth, development, and enterprise development, and not merely the distribution of existing wealth. So when you look at the 2003 strategy, of which it has not been amended throughout in all these other pieces of legislation that have been amended throughout the years. And currently, the department is now looking at amending that strategy. And I think some of these issues, and I noted when Tendani was also talking about the specific fund for employee ownership schemes, of which it's not currently there, that specific fund. And I think it's something that as we amend the BE strategy, looking at the BE financing and how do we then incorporate that into that process. So we are busy with that process. And also when you look at the act that now was amended in 2013, that makes a provision to the establishment of the BE Commission. Well, it defines broad-based economic empowerment as means the viable economic empowerment of all people, in particular women, workers, youth, people with disability, and people living in rural areas, through diverse but integrated socio-economic strategies that includes but are not limited to the facilitating ownership and management of enterprises and productive assets by communities, workers, cooperatives, and other collective enterprises. And also, when you look again into the National Development Plan, the increased ownership of enterprises, both existing and new, by Black people as individual and collective enterprises, is a golden trend, waving the definition of Black economic empowerment into the objective thereof. And that is also incorporated in terms of when you look at the outcome 4 of the National Development Plan. In 2030, the economy should be close to full employment, equip people with the skills they need, ensure that ownership of production is less concentrated and more diverse, where Black people and women own a significant share of productive assets and be able to grow rapidly, providing the resources to pay for investment in human and physical capital. And also when you look again in outcome 8, of the National Development Plan, economic opportunities for historically excluded and vulnerable groups are expanded, and the growth and development in small businesses and cooperative is improved markedly, while all economic policies and programs should provide specific support for historically excluded and vulnerable groups. So there are a lot of programs in the market when it comes to supporting BEE, and throughout the years, since there was no specific agency like the BEE Commission currently, in terms of now reporting as private sector and also as government in terms of our BEE, how do we then see whether as a country we are progressing or not? And now we are now looking at the reports that are submitted to the BEE Commission in terms of the Act, Section 13G. All entities are now required to submit in terms of their BEE spend, in terms of their BEE compliance, in terms of the BEE deals that companies are currently busy with. And then when you look at Section 14, subsection 2 of the Act, it gives now the minister may now by notice in the Gazette issue guidelines and practice note relating to the interpretation of the Act. So the practice note therefore confirms the correct interpretation and the application of the legislation. It cannot contradict the Act or the codes. The issuance of a practice note in terms of Section 14 of the Act is a legislative function of Parliament delegated to the minister, and an executive power as per Section 85, subsection 2E of the Constitution of the Republic. It is therefore legally binding on all users of the legislation, inclusive of measured entities and implementation agencies such as the SANAS and the BEE Commission. So now the practice notes was responding to the interpretative misalignment on how discretionary collective enterprises such as broad-based schemes, your ESOPs, trade unions, investment holding companies that are broad-based schemes, not-for-profit companies and trust, amongst other juristic persons, should be treated in terms of the broad-based economic empowerment legislation. There has been a significant differences of opinion between the BEE Commission and the major entities in the BEE space on how ownership structures like discretionary collective enterprises, which provide for some discretion in respect of the distribution of proceeds to beneficiaries, should be considered for ownership purposes under the codes. These differences of opinion manifest in the practice guide and other public forms of communication by the Commission. Such differences at times conflict or conflicted with the BEE Act and the codes of good practice, most significantly with the objectives of the BEE policy as detailed in the Act. So while opinions issued by the BEE Commission is not binding, the refusal by the Commission to register BEE transactions which do not conform the interpretation advanced by the Commission resulted in regulatory uncertainty. As a custodian of the BEE policy, the minister had to affirm the correct government policy as legislated by the BEE Act, which is that broad-based empowerment embraces a number of aspects, including facilitating ownership by groups of designated persons through vehicles such as the cooperatives, women investment vehicles, youth empowerment structures, trade union investment vehicles, and community welfare projects, not only the traditional model of a share ownership being held directly or indirectly to the name and for the account of individuals from the designated groups. So now you look at the rules of these collective enterprises. Discretionary collective enterprise in line with the objectives of the BE Act, especially 2C of the objectives of the Act, where we talk about increasing the extent to which communities, workers, cooperatives, and other collective enterprises own and manage existing and new enterprises, and increasing their access to economic activities, infrastructures, and skills training. And there is an expression, there is express recognition that schemes that provide for a discretion to the fiduciary of the scheme to select individuals from a defined class of beneficiaries that will benefit out of distribution of the scheme, and allow for a fiduciary to determine the proportion of entitlement that a particular beneficiary will receive once selected out of the defined class of natural person are acceptable for a BE recognition. Those examples are also included in the practice note that will provide such clarity. So this practice note, it was just to clear those misalignment in the market. A scheme which does not provide the discretion to the fiduciary to distribute less than the fixed percentage or amount determined in terms of the formula to beneficiaries who are members of the defined class of natural person meets the requirements that the fiduciary may have no discretion. So, in line now with the Companies Act, distribution may be in cash or in kind, and attract economic interest points recognition. So, whilst we are still looking at the rules for collective enterprises, the distribution need to be made every year of economic interest recognition. Fiduciaries of the scheme need to be they need to be exercised the fiduciary duties as determined by the instrument used. This might include a decision to make any distribution in a particular year. So, as Shaun was doing his presentation, I think one of the key issues is that the ESOPs has not been a primary focus in terms of now looking holistically into the BE. And I think currently that is what now it is been driven within the department by the minister to say, how do we then try and advocate in terms of when we advocate on BE, let's also advocate in terms of the ESOPs, because now we've seen a lot of companies now looking at various ways of be able to comply with the ownership. Those that can perhaps maybe not sell equity or they don't want to dilute their ownership, but they move to these broad-based schemes. We've seen a lot of multinationals now also participating into these ESOPs, the broad-based schemes, the trust, all these different kinds of employee of broad-based schemes. So it is an issue now, Cindy, of how do we then, as DTIC, making sure that we advocate more, because there is still that element of most companies not understanding how these broad-based schemes work, and also some of them they've worked. Most employees, they've benefited, and you've seen those that haven't worked much, where you have now, you've seen an element of fronting in it. So those are the things that now we are also looking at as we now moving towards in terms of amending the BEE strategy, so that it can also be aligned with all these pieces of legislation, and also now trying to see that how do we then make sure that all these things that were not coming out into the strategy, then maybe can be able to also influence the act and the codes as we change this legislation. So I'm not going to go through all this. I've shared the presentation with you, Cindy. Then you can be able to circulate to the attendees. But what I can say is that I think through the listed companies which are required to report to the BEE Commission in terms of 13G, Section 13G of the BEE Act, that have collective enterprises in its chain of ownership that are not capable of reporting on disaggregated information. For example, BEE, the Black people in terms of racial classification, their number, their province or age, will be required to report only on the participation of Black people, but not the other categories, and must do so in line with the information that is collective enterprise are able to produce. Measured entity which is unable to produce verified information requested cannot, however, be compelled to do so, and therefore cannot be considered as a non-compliant with the requirement of an extra 100 in terms of the ownership element. And it is, however, encouraged to report as much disaggregated information as responsible possible. So now in terms of the department now requesting reporting from all the DTI agencies, as those are the things that are now coming out to say within even all the companies that the department has funded, they've got programs in place. When they report to the DTIC, they must also report in terms of their ESOPs, their broad-based, how much has been spent there, how are we going to assist employees, because you'll remember in terms of ownership, as Shaun has touched on in terms of the scorecard, the broad-based are part of the scorecard, and also in terms of now the issue of how then these employees are able to pay those shares. Then it also again goes back to the structure on how these broad-based or ESOPs are structured, how the dividends are being declared, so that there is that movement of paying those shares through those dividends that are paid by companies. So those are the things that the BEE Commission, as they receive this report, to look at in terms of, because we don't want to find a situation whereby we've got employees that are indebted because of these employee share schemes, and now they cannot be able to enjoy, because at the end of the day, you want to see them enjoying that wealth that comes with those ESOPs. So within the reports, we are tracking in terms of those that are doing well and those that are not, and what will be the issues, and also trying to encourage a lot of companies in terms of now they are structuring in terms of ownership. And also let's look at the asset, because if you look at it, when you engage or involve employees into your ownership structure, you will see a lot of employees being able to treat these companies as their own, because obviously now it gives them that empowerment and that ownership, so that they can be able to grow these businesses. And you will even perhaps see a less of now companies asking for increments, and because obviously they've got the structure of how the company is operating, and also they are being involved in terms of them being employee share ownership schemes. So in my closing, Cindy, I would like also say that as the policy, and also in terms of now looking at the amendment of the strategy, also looking at all these, when we look at the reports that are coming from the commission, what are the loopholes, and what are the shortcomings, and how do we then incorporate that so that it can also feature incorporated into the amendment of the strategy, of which that amendment will also maybe influence the amendment of the codes, and also the codes of the act itself. So we are looking at those, and I think with this collective, obviously there will be a time where we will go out and discuss in terms of the amendments of the strategy, so to get the views from the market. And I think those things will come sharply, so that it can also be incorporated into the amendment of the strategy. I thank you, Cindy. Give back to you.
Thank you, Lumka. And indeed, we appreciate the fact that our government is fully behind employee BEE and employee ownership. Of course, at the moment, it appears as if ESOPs are the ones that are prevalent, or that are taking some precedent to a certain extent. That, of course, is largely influenced by the culture and the manner in which South Africa legal framework is structured, especially the BE framework. So what we'll do now going forward is Dr. Jenica Govinda will do the closing remarks and take questions from the participants, and also thank all the panelists. Over to you, Dr. Govind.
Thank you, Cindy, and thank you to all the panelists. I mean, we started off with good insights from the opening remarks, with Prof. Logan setting the scene, giving us a good context of the South African landscape regarding employer ownership, and then for Prof. Doel coming in, giving us good detailed analysis of the international context. And then, of course, we had Mr. Smit that came in, who then brought us to speak about the more, I think, practical elements of BEE and employment ownership. And then Ms. Lumka coming in, telling us about government stance, and the way we need to interpret employer ownership in South Africa today. These are burning issues, and I think the reason also for Wits Business School coming alongside Tendani and team to unpack a critical aspect of employee participation in the workplace. And for me, the one thing that stands out is actually what Tendani said, that this is a natural remedy. And Prof. Doel later says that it's about time that organizations match their actions. So to actually literally have organizations partner with employees. And Mr. Smith very nicely, Shaun put it in very nicely, saying that it's not something that is not impractical. It is something that is highly doable, but we need to start beginning with the collaboration. The collaboration or the collaborative process needs to begin. And I think through these discussions, we will be able to get more of this type of momentum going and have people to have conversations that are similar to this. So I'd like to open up the floor to any questions at this point. If any of our participants or panel members would like to say something or has a question, we more than welcome your participation right now. So maybe with an indication of a hand, you could come through. We are open for questions. Thank you. The interesting thing about it, while questions do come in, is the practicality of it, the value that comes out of it. We see how clearly Prof. Doel, speaks about the opportunities that can come out of this type of relationship or collaborative work engagement that I think we desperately need to see in South Africa. And we may see some positive signs in other parts of the world, but in South Africa, it probably has the potential to probably mitigate strike action going forward, help with services, and help with stabilizing the economy to a large extent. With all of these positives being said, it's about time that we see more action or more movement in this direction. It's quite an interesting space to see how organizations are now repackaging employee participation. And there is a lot of room for employee ownership. Are there any questions from our participants? I don't think that there are at this moment.
Dr. Gobin,
Yes, please come in, Tendani.
are
Thank
they
you.
allowed to raise their hands? Maybe we need to check with Jayton as whether are they enabled to raise their hands and also enabled to ask the questions. I'm not sure. I
Okay.
just saw one chat. There is one question that comes through a chat there.
100%. Thanks, Tendani, for alerting me to that. Maybe colleagues, if you're unable to raise your hand, come through with your question or type your question into the chat bar. We can read that out and we can respond accordingly. So the first question comes from Dikeledi. Could EO meaningfully contribute to the ongoing DEI transformation talks, and does it belong in that space? So I'm opening that up to our panelists who would like to come in and possibly respond to the question that was posed by Dikeledi. Shaun, might I just pounce on you? Maybe if you could give us some insight on the question that was posed. I do hope that you too can see the question in the chat box. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. I'm not 100% the question. As you know, as I was discussing, I think a key driver of ESOPs in South Africa has been BEE, and BEE to an extent, you know, is obviously addressing DEI. So I don't know if you mean broader DEI in terms of the question, but I think in short, I think the answer is yes. ESOPs could be used to drive DEI. I think again, there are so many different ways to structure an ESOP, and I think when you're looking at implementing an ESOP, you need to think about how do you define success? What are the outcomes that you're seeking to achieve? And with that clearly defined, what kind of structure and what kind of benefit structure, what kind of scheme do you need to have in place to achieve those outcomes? And so essentially what I'm saying is, depending on your objectives and what you're trying to achieve out of it, be it driving certain aspects of DEI or whatever, it can be achieved in an ESOP. So I think ESOPs can be used for that perspective.
Thank you, Shaun. I think basically this is the starting point, and maybe like the question being posed is the starting point for you to further investigate the benefits thereof. So yeah, that's a good point. I do not see any other questions that have been placed in the chat box. So are there any closing remarks from our esteemed panelists? Maybe just a one-liner that you would like to add regarding this very important conversation.
Let me go first.
There's another, apologize for interrupting. I see there's another hand up. Shumani, if you can unmute and pose your question, please. I do not think that Shumani can pose his. Yes.
I have unmuted. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Please come through. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much for the presentation. I apologized. I joined the presentation a little bit, I think an hour late because I was still on another meeting, but I'm not sure if what I'm going to ask, it has been addressed. Looking at this, the BEE through the involving of the employees in the ownership of the companies. I think it's a concept that some of the companies has done it previously, but the concern is, from my side, there's not too much of a success, because these schemes, they end up giving an opportunity for the employees to sell out their shares, or companies just decide to close the schemes and they give out, or they pay out in terms of the money. What can be done to make sure that paying out, it does not happen, the ownership, it continues? That's one thing. The other part is, one of the other things with the BEE, it was also trying to empower the Black-owned companies. And I had a bit of a presentation by the person from DTI. What is DTI really doing in terms of removing the red tapes with the empowerment and the funding of Black-owned companies, to make it easier for them to get the funding so that they can have ownership and build the economy? I'll just stop on those two questions for now. Thank you.
Duncan, do you want to go first, or should I try to answer the first question first?
Answer Shaun the first question. I will answer the red tape. Thanks.
Sure. Shumani, I think historically ESOPs traditionally have had a fixed term. Many ESOPs had a fixed term over which there was a view of potential capital appreciation. And as you said, there's an end date and the scheme ends, and then there's usually, hopefully, there's a payout. In certain schemes at that point in time, value wasn't positive and there wasn't a payout. And I think over time and through experience, it's been recognized that that potentially or actually isn't the best way to structure ESOPs in terms of enduring benefit and positive value creation. So I think we're naturally seeing an evolution of structuring of ESOPs to be more longer term and some being evergreen. But in short, to answer your question, how it can be addressed is really by the company implementing the ESOPs and essentially choosing how to structure this. Is it something that's going to go on for a lot longer? Is it something that's going to go on indefinitely? Is it going to be an evergreen ESOP? And as I said, we're seeing movement towards that approach. So it's definitely doable, and it's really in the hands of the company implementing the ESOP. Tendani, you want to add something?
Yeah,
Tendani. Yes.
Thanks, Shaun, for that. I want to add on something because he raised some of the things that are very critical. And as he said, he joined a little bit later. One of the critical issue is the fact that we need to educate shareholders, we need to educate employees, we need to educate any stakeholder that will be involved in the process, because that's what strengthens the employee ownership within the company. Why most of the time employees sell shares? It's on the basis that they are ill-informed and they don't understand the long-term benefit of owning equity in the companies that they participate in. Then I just wanted to add that other part to say the success of employee ownership, it's also on education and training. And that can be supported by a lot of research that has been done locally and internationally. Thank you.
I wanted to ask a question as well. Within South Africa for employee ownership, is there also a profit sharing component, or is the only wealth that's created is within the ESOP? Because if you go back to Maslow, you have to be able to supply those lower order needs to be able to achieve those higher order needs. And if all of the wealth is tied up in just share ownership and there's no profit sharing piece, that wealth may be needed just for day to day.
Prof, I think most often there is an element of profit sharing as well, be it, it comes in many different forms, but usually if you look at the overall remuneration structure, there are components of profit sharing or profit linked benefit.
Thank you, Shaun. I think I'm going to get Limca in because we have a few minutes remaining. And Limca, please, would you
Yes.
answer the last piece of question? Thank you.
Thank you, thank you. I'm going to just touch on the issue of removing the red tape, and I think that is something that we are busy with in terms of because these issues also came from the Parliament to say how are we dealing with the issues of removing the red tape. That process where these black-owned entities, when they come and seek for funding, then there will be these processes that will also block them to be able to acquire those funding. So that is something that as a department we are dealing with, looking at all the DFIs that are funding BE black-owned entities, and I think this is the element that, as I said, that it will also assist in terms of now when we amending the strategy, how do we then, in terms of BE financing within the BE strategy, include such issues to say we must not be able to put a lot of regulatory burden when it comes to black-owned entities when they come and ask for funding. Those are the things that we are currently looking at that can be able to find itself into the BE strategy, because if anything does not come into a policy kind of or a framework, it gets to not being taken seriously. So now that we are in this process of amending the BE strategy, looking at the financing of BE, how do we then also put this issue of red tape within that component, so that when we the strategy now gets to be implemented by other departments and DFIs, it is something that is embedded within the legislation. Thank you.
Thank you, Limca. There is one other comment that has come through in the chat, and it's from Edward, who says, hi, I liked what Mr. Tendani mentioned of ownership of key assets such as renewable plants through ESOPs. The example of Eskom and employee ownership and participation. How would we take these conversations further to companies and making it a part of ESOP implementation policy? And I think that is an ongoing conversation. That's an ongoing initiative. And today is the day where we are starting such conversation. And we are here in a room with stakeholders and contributors and minds that are vested in ESOP. And I think this is the very beginning of our conversations. And maybe that these conversations provoke stakeholders to start embracing ESOPs. I don't know, Tendani, if you would like to add something on that as we approach our 6 o'clock and we close our session in a few minutes.
I think, Janika, just to add before Tendani comes in
Sure.
this question, to say that as we advocate, as a department, advocating all these departments, SOEs and private sector, when they develop their transformation strategy, these are the issues that needs to come out of those transformation strategy as departments and as SOEs and as private sector. So once that comes out of their strategy, and now it needs to be implemented, because the issue is that you find companies, they don't have any transformation strategy on how are they going to now implement BE in their space. And these kind of whether it's ESOPs or broad-based schemes, they tend to be left out because there is no structure that is introduced in terms of transformation in departments. I think it's something that we've been advocating a lot to say, as we now move into the transformation, whether it's government, because obviously as government we have to implement broad-based BEE, and also the state-owned entities. They must have that element of having their transformation strategy so that they can be able to implement BEE, implement it well in certain extent that it also covers their employees in terms of empowering their employees in their companies. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Gobind, and thank you, Lumka, for bringing that one to say, going forward, most of these need to be part of their transformation strategy. Then, and thanks, Edward. I think from our side, why we mentioned ESCOM as an example, we looked at it as something that is presenting an opportunity, whereby I think very soon we'll have to have a dialogue, maybe a discussion that will be robust around the whole issue to say, how best can we bring employee ownership in the energy sector, but zooming strictly to ESCOM and other multinationals. Like I can give you additional example in the mining sector. Most of the mining companies are moving away from using ESCOM energy, and they're generating their own energy. Then now I always question as a person to say, you have your employees always striking for salary increases, but why can't you give them the opportunity to generate power and sell power back to you as an entity? And this can be supported by an initiative. When I was still at IDC, I wrote a policy around issues of how best can we use value chain of companies to drive employee ownership. And as far as I understand, that policy is working so well for IDC, not only pushing ownership at the company's level. Then from my side, I will say, on the basis of the association, we will want to have an agent, a dialogue around issue of energy, participation of employees in the energy economic opportunity. Then that's something that we will want to do as soon as possible, because it's something that is current, and we really believe that employee ownership can contribute in reducing load shedding, not only the IPPs as independent as they are called. That's what I could say based on the comment and the question. Going forward, it's a conversation through policy dialogue around the energy issue and how to incorporate employees into that. Thank you.
Thank you, Tendani. I think Tendani has raised something quite important, and that is, employee ownership in the energy space, and particularly since where the country is right now, and talking about the load shedding component, or going forward, looking at renewable energy and the role that employees can have in playing in this important space. So, colleagues, I would like to thank you for sharing your afternoon with us, spending time unpacking an area that needs much more conversation, much more deliberation, and a lot of action. And I thank you for your questions. I thank our panelists for joining us from afar and close. You certainly brought in aspects that we would have not have considered, and an international viewpoint on aspects that pertain to employee ownership. I know Prof. Logan is still in the room with us. Prof, if you would like to add a few words as we close off. Before Prof comes in, I'd like to thank Cindy, Tendani, the ICT team, Jayton, and Mecca for putting our webinar together. Many thanks, colleagues. Prof. Logan, would you like to come in to say, add anything? Thank you.
Not much, Jenny, just to say, it's been a tremendous pleasure hosting this webinar. We look forward to engaging with all the panelists and also with all the delegates that have attended here. This is a new area. I think it's an important area that we need to actively engage on. And Wits Business School look forward to, being part of the journey with everyone who wants to come along. So once again, thanks for attending, and we look forward to hosting, a few other seminars going forward. Thanks, Jenny.
Thank you, Prof. Cindy, back to you. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Dr. Gobind, and thank you to everyone who made it to this webinar. And I think we actually exceeded our time. Fairly soon, this thing is going to log us out. You know how Zoom sometimes surprises people. But thank you to everyone, Prof. Doel, Prof. Smit, Dr. Shaun, Lumka, and Tendani, and the ITC team. Thank you, and the participants. Over to you, Tendani.
Thank you, Cindy. As you have already thanked everybody, I will just say, everybody have a safe journey wherever way you will be traveling. We're looking forward to engage with you on more topics to come. Thank you so much.
Thank you, colleagues. Bye-bye.